Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. This time we'll be looking at Back into the Storm by Bil Herd. This is a wonderful book. Bil Herd has a unique story to tell. It's pretty different from some of the other engineers that I've read about. And, it's kind of a fun story to look back at and just kind of see what this guy was able to accomplish in kind of a short time at Commodore. So Bill worked at Commodore in the mid-80s. This was when the company was riding high off of its success from the Commodore 64, and he left right before they came plummeting back to Earth. His book provides a lot of insight into mostly the problems that were going on at Commodore, and kind of tells us a little bit about why the company was so unique. He talks about two major projects that he worked on in this book. Basically two computers that he developed, the Plus 4 and the Commodore 128, as both of them would be known once they were finished. While those two are important for a few reasons, I think his talks about the management structure that kind of struck a nerve for me, and I found that to be somewhat more interesting than the two computers he was talking about. I didn't grow up with Commodore computers, so a lot of this didn't really strike like a nostalgic feeling for me. But that stuff about management, man, that really hit home for me in a lot of ways. I do want to point out one thing that might be a little bit of a problem if you just pick this up. I felt like there was some expectation of like a background knowledge of Commodore before you started reading this. I can understand why, because usually if you're a fan of something, you're going to want to pick up a book that's about it. But yeah, so how can I put this? I guess I just felt like I needed to point that out. Like, some of the stuff might not make sense to just an average reader. If I hadn't read other books about Commodore, I wouldn't have got what Bill was talking about in some cases. Reading this reminded me of the other books that I have read, and thankfully it did, because I might have had to, stop and go look some of this stuff up while I was reading it. I kept thinking about how Commodore itself kind of had a self-sabotage fetish, and it was like they didn't want to succeed, especially, if success wasn't being credited to the right people at times. There's a lot to go over in this, so let's start off with Bill talking about the Plus 4 and then some of the more significant problems that were going on at Commodore. So with the Plus 4, Bill talks about a few things that go on with it. One is kind of the identity crisis that it had. This was supposed to be part of a line of business machines. There were supposed to be several in this line. He talks about 3 different computers that were being produced at the same time. They were all supposed to be these business machines. And when you dig into Commodore's history, you find out a lot about their failed business machines. But we're just going to focus on this one. Unfortunately, just because you market something as a business machine or as an educational machine or something like that, it doesn't mean the consumer is going to use it that way. That just means that's what marketing thinks the thing is. It also doesn't mean that Commodore isn't going to change its mind and scrap most of the line, which is what happened with the Plus 4. It was originally supposed to be the Commodore 264, and it was supposed to be like much lower cost than what it was. Bill talks about how the computer was supposed to be sold for $79, and it ended up being sold for $379. And the worst part about it was it wasn't backwards compatible with the Commodore 64. He talks about a software developer showing him some educational software, and she says, this stuff will not work on the Plus 4. And that was a pretty big issue for Commodore. A lot of their stuff wasn't backwards compatible. So you have this huge library, especially with the Commodore 64, and you have the new computer come out and it can't take advantage of an existing library of software, and it can't take advantage of the people who are making software for it. People were making software for the Commodore 64 for a very long time, and I think they might still be making software for it. And you have Commodore that would come out with a new computer, and they're like, well, this one is technologically more superior and everything, so everybody's just going to drop the old computer and upgrade to this one. And that didn't really happen. It was one of those things that just, I felt like it was part of Commodore just screwing themselves over. You could have released a computer that already had, I can't remember how much it actually, I think the Commodore 64 at its height had about 10,000 programs for it. That's going to be much later in the 90s, but you have this new computer that comes out and it can't take advantage of all of the other software. It's just one of those weird things, and that sort of got Bill's wheels turning, and the next computer he would work on, he would do his best to make that one be backwards compatible, or at least as backwards compatible as they could get it. Before we get into the 128, I just want to mention two things really quick. We hear a lot about FCC certifications in this, and I think that's really cool because that's not something I often hear described. I've only really read about it in the Commodore books from Brian Bagnall and also with Bil Herd here. And it's kind of cool to read about those because I don't know anything about what it takes to really get something certified through the FCC. We also hear about Bill's issues with the QA managers and other middle managers that I'll get into later, but those stories are probably my favorite ones out of all of these. They're just really great to hear about. They're probably incredibly frustrating at the time for Bill, but they're pretty entertaining, especially just, knowing that you don't have to deal with it yourself. So we get to the development of the Commodore 128, and this takes up the bulk of the book. Like, he goes through a lot of stuff here, and most of it's very interesting. However, when he goes into some of the technical stuff, that's when the book kind of started to go over my head a bit. And Bill does a good job of trying to simplify this as best he can, but there are times where I'm just like, yeah, I have no concept of what you're talking about here, and I was kind of getting lost in some of the details. I kind of wish that I had a background in engineering when I was going into this, because I really, I feel like I should know more about it, but I just don't. Like, I never built my own PC or anything like that. So when I'm hearing about a lot of these things, I'm not totally sure what he's talking about. And a lot of this gets into like actually like design engineering and that kind of thing. And you're talking about building computers back in the 80s, and I just sort of have to take what the author is saying. It's fine here with Bill because I don't hear like conflicting information from various engineers. So I don't hear Bill talk about, well, this is how, this is how I did it and everything. And then you get quotes from other engineers that are like, and that's the wrong way to do it. And yeah, it can get a little confusing. When I was reading Brian Bagnall's Commodore books, that was kind of driving me crazy, because you would hear one engineer talk about, oh, we're doing this. This was really groundbreaking. We're putting these chips in this way. We're setting everything up like this. We added in these transistors. And then you hear the next engineer say, it's a disaster. Like, it's an ugly design. Nobody liked it. It didn't work. And it kind of made me think, well, then why was this guy telling me this, and why is it different now? With Bill, you thankfully, since this is Bill's book, and you don't hear a lot of you don't hear other voices in it for the most part. You just get Bill explaining his rationale as to why all of these things are going the way they are. And that kind of makes more sense to me, but I still don't really know exactly what he's talking about all the time. I will say this, though. Bill does an excellent job of explaining these things for someone like me that doesn't have a background in it. It's just every once in a while that I kind of I would look at the page and just go, I'm not totally sure what I read. But, sorry about that. I am done rambling about that for now. So we start with Bill kind of taking over the project, and we read and I've read two different accounts of this, and both of them have Bill working on another project and kind of stepping forward and solving the problems with what would become the 128. It's kind of nice having those two different accounts that both pretty much agree on things. And when I was reading Bill's account of it, it sounded very much like the stories that I had read in Brian Bagnall's book. So it was just kind of nice to see that and go, okay, well, this is definitely how it happened. It's not just one person's perspective. It's multiple people talking about it. Brian does mention the engineer's name, so and he talks about how other people felt about that engineer. That's kind of left out of here for the most part when you read Bill's book. So it is kind of interesting to hear how other people thought about the different engineers, and that's one kind of interesting thing here. Bill is a bit more diplomatic in his account of the story. Those stories are kind of simplified. He kind of simplifies the story down a little bit, because I felt like he wanted to keep moving on with the project. And I don't think it's really a big deal. I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the differences in the accounts. The Commodore 128 team was kind of small, and they were really like close knit from everything that I've read, both in Bill's books and in Bill's book and in other books. And that's kind of cool. Like, they get referred to as the Commodore 128 animals, and it just sort of seems as they really just worked well together. Bill seems to have been both acting as an engineer and kind of as the project manager. He talks about how he was tracking problems, through each iteration of the computer, and just working on all of the major like show-stopping problems as they came up, and solving like a bunch of the smaller problems sort of as he could. And he talks about wanting to get all of the problems solved like every day. So like every day they would have a list of problems, and he would want to get all of them solved before they were done. He also explains what they needed to do in order to get close to 100% compatibility with the Commodore 64. Hearing about that, man, like that sounded like it might have been like way too complicated. And it's probably just because of me not having the right background, but the stuff he's talking about, I'm like, this sounds ridiculous. Like how you were just getting everything put together as best you could. It kind of, without like seeing it being put together in real time, it really felt like to me like this thing was just being slapped together. And I know that's not the way it turns out, but it just sort of sounds like they're just doing stuff and slapping things in there, trying to figure out how to get different stuff to work, and like tricking the computer into doing it what they wanted it to do. It sounds pretty crazy when you actually read his story. The games and the other software are gone over quite a bit, like especially with what he had to do from a testing standpoint. And Bill tries to get each of them to work on the 128. He never said that. So this is one thing that's kind of interesting to me, and it kind of talks about some of the problems at Commodore. Bill and his team never said that it would be 100% compatible. Commodore's marketing department kind of decided that, and then other people just ran with it. And you would see them like go to trade shows to show off like their latest build of the computer, and you'd have the marketing team advertising features that were either removed already or were never promised. And however, like, since the marketing team decided, this was going to be in the computer, or they heard a mention of it from Bill's boss, like, Bill had to make it work on the computer. I can't really imagine how annoying that would be. Yeah, it sounds pretty ridiculous. There's talk of what chips make up the 128 as well, and two of them kind of stood out to me. And one of them only stood out because I had heard of it before, and that was the Z80 processor, or the Zilog 80. And yeah, and how that one just kind of got put in there, and to kind of make the Commodore 28 a dual processor computer. I knew a little bit about it, and I had read a few other stories, like how when they put it in there, I think it was Commodore's Australia branch was like, well, we're going to rip it out of every computer, which would have made the thing like not functional and everything like that. It's kind of interesting. Like he went around to all of the, oh god, I believe the Sinclair ZX Spectrums, and he was like ripping all the Z80s out to like test them in the computer to make sure the design worked. It was kind of fun. The other chip is the 8563 chip. I don't really know too much about it aside from what Bill is telling me here. And Bill kind of talks about how he sort of got stuck with this chip. He was planning on using a different one, and then somebody came up to him and said, well, you can use this. And Bill admits like he didn't ask the right questions before agreeing to use this. He was just kind of said, well, is it like this? And the engineer was like, yeah, it's exactly like that. And they found out that the chip wasn't, it sounds like the chip was not the right one that they should have been using, but they kind of got stuck with it in the design. So they eventually get the Commodore 128 out and everything. But this kind of leads me to the last thing I really want to talk about, and that was his issues with middle managers and that sort of thing. It seems like he had the most issues with he had the most issues with the QA department, particularly the QA managers that kept trying to get him fired. And he doesn't mince words about it. And from what I've read in other books, yeah, they were really trying to get him fired because they didn't believe in the 128. It seems like at Commodore there was a lot of not invented here, or if like they didn't come up with if one department didn't come up with the idea, then it was a bad idea. And that seems to be what happened, at least from my reading of this and some other stuff. That someone didn't come up with the Commodore 128, and they didn't like the fact that another group was working on it, so they decided to kind of sabotage it. Which seems totally bizarre to me, that one company that's goal is to try to make money, that they are just constantly sabotaging themselves because they didn't come up with an idea that was a good idea. So, or they didn't come up with an idea, so they immediately assumed it was not a good idea. It's a very weird environment to work in. and I have worked in environments like that. With the QA manager, though, they would do weird things like, they would have a meeting and they would say the Commodore 128 doesn't work. Like, there was one particular meeting that I've heard the story in two different ways, and I've heard this story two different times, and they both sound pretty similar. And it's one QA manager saying the Commodore 64 doesn't, or the Commodore 128 doesn't work, here's the problem. And they're blaming Bill for it. And Bill would say, yes, I understand what the problem is, here's how we're going to fix it. And, that's it. And the manager was just not hearing any of it. He's like, no, it doesn't work, it's broken, it's your fault. And Bill would repeat, no, we know how to fix it, this is our plan to get it fixed. And finally a senior manager had to step in to say, look, I think Bill has a plan on how to fix it. And, it was just one of those times where I'm like, yeah, the managers went into that meeting, the middle managers went into a meeting to get Bill fired, and it turns out the senior manager didn't wasn't exactly on the same page. So Bill's bosses wanted to get him fired, but Bill's boss's boss didn't, because he understood what Bill was talking about. Hearing Bill's stories of just the tribalism in Commodore was kind of, that's the part that really struck a nerve with me in this book, where you just have one group of people at a company that has the ear of the boss, and if they don't come up with an idea on how to fix something, then the idea is bad and it doesn't need to be done. And reading over that part, I was reading that and I was just like, man, I've been there. I've been there so many times, where you try to convince people that you're right and the decision that you know is right, and just nobody wants to believe you. It's really frustrating to deal with. There are a bunch of other really fun stories in here, like Bill's interest in Robotech. I thought was really cool. Like that was fun to read about, and just hearing him, not hearing him, but reading about him going to Japan and kind of falling in love with the culture and everything. I thought that was really cool, and just hearing him talk about some of the friends that he made while he was there, that was really great. I really like this book just because Bill does do a good job of explaining things to people that don't know that much about computers, every once in a while there were a few issues for me, but for the most part I kind of got what he was talking about. It also gives you a lot of really good insight into the problems at Commodore, and Bill talks about some of the many issues that they had there. I'm really glad that I got like Bill's side of the story in this. Like, this book is really great if you want to know more about the development of the Plus 4 and the Commodore 128. So that's going to wrap things up, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you like this format, let me know about that too. Anyway, talk to you guys later. Bye.